I don't know if you'll believe this. This is the first time I've been up here since the stage is gone. I like it. I don't know. It does feel a little weird, but I kind of like it. I don't have a lot of segue into this for the lesson tonight. So in the interest of that, let's just turn over to Acts chapter 12. Acts chapter 12. There are different, we've talked about this a number of times, there are different types of literature in the Bible. We just got done studying the Psalms over the summer. We looked at the law code in Exodus. So there's poetry, there's law code, there are letters, Paul's epistles, they're letters. And then there is the easiest and best by a wide margin, which is the vast majority of the scripture, narrative. Most of the Bible is story. And what you'll find is people have a much easier time, and maybe you've felt this, it's a lot easier to read a story than it is to try and jump into ancient Near Eastern poetry. It's just easier to read the story than it is a lot of other types of literature. And I think that is in part one of the reasons why the book of Acts has so much popularity. A lot of people like the book of Acts, and it might just be because Acts is a giant story. It's the largest book of narrative in the New Testament. You've got the Gospels that do absolutely tell the story of Jesus' life, and then you've got Acts, and then you've got all the other ones, and none of those really have much story in them. But the book of Acts tells some really incredible stories. It was, 3.5, almost 4 years ago now, that I got to teach on the second half of the book of Acts. And what I realized when I was studying that was this could be a movie. Like, it was so action-packed. When you get past, Acts 17, 18, 19, you start getting into some stories about Paul on his missionary journeys and how he's chased from town to town and how he goes into one town and preaches and then gets chased out. And then he's under arrest and then he gets shipwrecked. And I mean, it is just an action-packed story. I heard somebody describe the book of Acts as a prison break novel, which is kind of funny and kind of real. There's this thing that happens when you notice that when the setting is prison, something is going to happen. Something is going to take place, and often the person is going to escape from prison, which is kind of a fun way to think about it. We have one of those stories in Acts chapter 12. So flip over to Acts chapter 12. We're going to look at verse 6 in Acts 12. Well, I'm sorry, we're going to just start in verse 1. I had that written wrong. Acts 12 and verse 1 says, "About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church." So Herod, who there are debates as to exactly which Herod this is, but for sure it was the Herod in charge at this time. I think it's Herod Agrippa. I can't remember exactly which Herod, but Herod does what most people in power do, which is attempt to please the masses. We are watching leaders attempt to please the masses. Have you noticed that in this political season? During this election, one of the goals is say things people want to hear. And then maybe do things people like. Maybe. But we want to at least get people to like what we say, right? Herod had sort of the same mindset. This was a very political move. Herod, as the king of the Jews, the Jews weren't supposed to have a king, A. B, Herod, if this is the Herod that I'm remembering it to be, was the son of a different Herod and one of 4 tetrarchs which were sort of like faux kings. They were kings, but not real kings. Like, Caesar was king, and they got to kind of be in charge of this area. And so, you've got this guy who doesn't have a great grasp on his power, and he's ruling over these people who feel as though they shouldn't even have a king, and he's definitely not their king. And so he's trying to please them. So he pulls James out and kills him in front of everybody. And this seemed to please the Jews, which, that's a disturbing comment, isn't it? That's a bit unsettling. It seems that this time, during the spread of Christianity, the Jews were still adamantly against. And this is after Paul is converted. This is after Paul was persecuting the Christians. And so you have Herod doing the same thing. He kills James, the brother of John, one of the 12 apostles, and he says, if that made him happy, let's see what they think when I get Peter. You would imagine Peter would be a pretty prominent member in the movement, in the community. And so that's Herod's plan. I killed one. That appeased these people for now. Let's arrest the other. And so he arrests Peter and takes him into prison. And he delivers him over to, I love the details, 4 squadrons or 4 squads of soldiers. So this wasn't just Peter was what's the phrase? He was a high priority prisoner, right? He was not just a guy you throw in jail. He was someone who had 4 squads set around him. He was a big deal. This was a big, big deal. Now, that doesn't mean that Peter was particularly violent or that he was particularly prone to escaping, although there was that one time in chapter 5 that he was put in prison and showed up the next. So maybe there was a little bit of that involved in this decision, but this was a high-profile arrest. Herod was doing it on purpose, publicly, and intentionally, and he arrests Peter and puts him in prison. And it says at the end, Peter was kept in prison in verse 5, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. And so people were praying for him. And if that's where that story ended, it'd be an interesting story, wouldn't it? It'd be one of those stories that if you're just right in the middle of this, how do you feel? The government just killed one of our leaders. And he arrested another one. And, he's probably dead too. That might be the mindset of the church, waiting on Peter, watching Peter's arrest. We saw how the crowd reacted. We saw how Herod reacted to the crowd reacting. This is coming for Peter too. What else can we do but pray? And so they pray. How seriously did they believe that their prayer was just going to fix the problem? I don't know. But it was earnest prayer, is what we're told. Verse 6. Now, when Herod was about to bring Peter out, on that very night, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. Again, high-profile inmate. He is maximum security. He's not got 1 chain but 2 chains. All right. Just what an interesting little detail, right? 2 soldiers, 2 chains, and 2 sentries guarding the door. Verse 7, and behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone in the cell, and he struck Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off of his hands. I want you to, what does it mean that the angel struck Peter? Have you thought about that? That's a pretty violent term. Jesus was struck when he was crucified. So, I don't know. This is just how my brain works. Have you ever had to wake somebody up who's a pretty hard sleeper? I'm not looking at anyone, but I do have one person in my house who rubbed off and gave birth to another person in my house, and neither one of these people wake up for anything. I remember when we were helping Bonnie learn to sleep through the night, potty training her, sleeping through the night, we had to go in and wake her up. As part of helping her, we'd go in and wake her up after she had been asleep for a couple of hours. And I remember the first night I went in there and did that. And I said, "Hey, Bon, let's go to the bathroom, babe." And, she'd been asleep for 3 hours or so, and I shake her, and she turns over. I pull the cover off of her, and she kicks it up and pulls it back. And I was like, well, I mean, she's awake now, right? So I kind of scooched her off the bed, and she just laid there with her legs hanging off the bed. And I was like, you're really asleep. So I had to pick her up and stand her on her legs and walk. I mean, she's a hard sleeper. And I wasn't trying to hurt her, right? So I didn't strike her. But what did this look like? This seems to be a pretty aggressive awakening, a bright light and a strike and a get up quickly. I mean, get up quickly after you get hit, on the side. This was not a gentle, quick, easy thing. You would think that the angel of the Lord would show up and be like, hey, we're just going to walk through this wall right here because we can. We'll do it however we want to because, I've got God's ordainment in this rescue mission. Very easy. But no, there's a sense of urgency. There's a strike. There's a wake up quickly, okay? And as this happens, the chains fell off of his hands. Just wonder what that looked like. Verse 8, and the angel said to him, dress yourself, put on your sandals. And he did so. And he said to him, wrap your cloak around you and follow me. I don't know, it just kind of sounds like a covert operation, doesn't it? Listen, get ready, get your shoes on, and cover up. Cover up. We're getting out of here. That doesn't sound like what the angel of the Lord would have to do, and yet that's exactly what the text says happened. He had Peter hiding, sneaking, if you will, out of prison. Verse 9, and he went out and followed him, and he did not know what was being done by the angel, if what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. And so Peter is in such a daze, right? It was such a confusing event for him that he's not sure if he's dreaming or if it's real, if he's having a vision or if this is really happening in real life, which, again, reminds me of a couple of people in my home. You don't know. Have you ever had somebody who, they weren't fully awake yet? Sometimes Moses will wake up from his nap, and he's got at least 15 minutes before he is coherent. I mean, he's 3, so he's not exactly coherent all the time anyway. But after a nap, I mean, it takes a minute to wake up. He doesn't really know where he is. And, I mean, you got Peter in kind of that same state. He's up. He's got his sandals on. He's got his clothes fastened. And is this a dream? I mean, Peter, you hear him say it. Wouldn't that make a great movie line? Is this a dream? Right? I'm telling you. Prison Break novel. That made so much sense when I heard this. Verse 10, when they had passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate leading into the city. It opened for them of its own accord, and they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel left him. When Peter came to himself, he said, now I am sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting. Well, what were they expecting? Execution. Because that's what happened to James. It pleased Herod, and that was Herod's plan. And so Peter, I mean, it says he came to himself. Peter the angel disappears, and he goes, okay, all right, this was real. This really happened. That was definitely God, and he saved me from everything that everyone feared would happen. Verse 12, when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark. There were many where many were gathered together and were praying. So you mentioned people praying for Peter. Well, this is where it was happening. And you just hear Peter kind of think, I know where people will be. I know people meet at Mary's house. I'm going to show up, and there will be people there to take me in. That's where I need to go. And so he heads over there, verse 13, and when he knocked at the door of the gateway, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. Recognizing Peter's voice, in her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. What is Peter at this point? Starts with an F, ends with a fugitive. He's a fugitive, right? He's escaped from prison, from high security prison. He has a cloak on. He sneaks over to Mary's house, and he knocks on the door, and I don't know what he's saying, but apparently he was speaking, and Rhoda recognized his voice. Guys, open up. It's Peter. Let me in. And she recognizes his voice and gets so excited that she goes, Peter, Peter, and takes off, leaving Peter outside of the house, exposed to the authorities. I mean, this is hilarious. This is a sitcom level trope. Like you've seen this in shows. It's just so she runs in to the room and just says, hey, Peter's here. She could have just brought him. It would have made a lot of sense. But in her excitement, she kind of lost herself and just darts in and says, hey, guys, Peter is here. And verse 15, they replied to her, you are out of your mind. But she kept insisting that it was so, and they kept saying, it must be, or it is, his angel. Like, there's no way this is Peter. You're crazy. He's not only in prison, he's tied up with 2 chains, right? Not one. Like, there's no way. You're out of your mind. If it is anyone, it's Peter's angel. I don't know what that means. Maybe they thought the deed had already been done. Peter was executed, and Herod was waiting until the next day to present this. Maybe they had thought that God allowed Peter to do some sort of miracle, which the apostles did, and appear to them in some mysterious way. I don't know. But as they're rationalizing this, it is a more logical explanation that this is Peter's angel, whatever that means, than that it is actually Peter who escaped from prison. That's the rationale of the people praying in the back room. What were they praying for again? Oh, Peter's deliverance. So funny. Verse 16, but Peter continued knocking, because he was exposed and probably going to be arrested again if they find him. And when they opened, they saw him and were amazed. They couldn't believe it. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, tell these things to James and to the brothers. Then he departed and went to another place. Now when the day came, there was no little disturbance among the soldiers over what had become of Peter. And after Herod searched for him and did not find him, he examined the centuries and ordered that they should be put to death. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and spent time there. This is just a funny story. Because not only, I feel like I keep hitting this microphone, not only is it funny, just the scene is a funny scene to think about. Peter knocking on the door, having just escaped from prison, and Rhoda leaving him outside, and then telling the people, and they don't believe him, and then they come find him, and they're about to be too loud because Peter has to motion to them, hey, be quiet, shh, no. If you yell Peter, they're going to come really quickly and find me. Right? Like, it's a funny scenario. But at the same time, it is just dripping with irony. Because if you just read this and remember that these are people in a back room praying for Peter's deliverance, and then they're surprised when he's delivered. There's another layer to this too. Not only are these people praying for Peter's deliverance, and then when he is delivered and they receive news of it, they don't believe it. The Bible gives us details, and those details often hold meaning within them. And there are a couple of phrases in this story that I think highlight some things about this that Luke was making sure people did not miss. The first thing is he mentions a time of year. He mentions when this was taking place. Back in verse 3, he arrested Peter also, and this was during the days of unleavened bread, which is one of the names for the Passover. And he'll even talk about it in, I believe, the next verse, saying that he was waiting for, after the Passover, to bring Peter out to the people. So the time frame is important here. It happened at Passover. All right? So what is Passover? Because when the New Testament authors give us something like that, they are pointing back. Rarely is there only one purpose for giving us a time frame. Now, it was Passover, and that's helpful. If you just, the people reading this originally were like, yeah, I remember that Passover. Wow, this was going on. That might have been a good point of reference for a historian to remember it was Passover. But that is not all that's being done. The mention of Passover is also, like we've said in the past, a part that's meant to sort of stand for the whole, to call back to something so that you remember what was being said. Well, if you go back to the Passover and you ask, what was the Passover celebrating? Well, the Passover was instituted in Exodus chapter 12. And we're not going to read all of this, but we're going to read a couple of things in Exodus 12. So flip back over there. Exodus chapter 12 comes right on the heels of the first 9 plagues. Right on the heels of the first 9 plagues. And following this, sorry, I thought I had this marked. Following the 9th plague of darkness, we had I'll get to that in a minute. But following the 9th plague of darkness, there's this It's just an interesting way that the story is told, because the final plague is sort of foretold or threatened in chapter 11, and then you jump into chapter 12, and it's like the whole thing is going to stop for a minute while we give you instructions on how to observe this holiday called the Passover. Like, pause, let me give you some instructions for a holiday. And they give some of these instructions, and one of the instructions is, look in verse 11. Exodus 12 and verse 11. God gets done telling Moses that you're gonna eat unleavened bread only, and there's not going to be any leaven, and this is how you're going to eat it. Verse 11: in this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. Which, it's so interesting, right? Like this, what a commandment to just do exactly what you would have to do when escaping from a nation. Right, because these people were going to be let go, and then if you remember the story, Pharaoh's going to change his mind. So they need to get out of there while Pharaoh's okay with it. And so God gives them this commandment. You need to go make sure when you are eating this feast, you got your belt fastened, you got your shoes on, your sandals on, and you got your staff. Get ready, right? Get your stuff and get ready to go and eat it quickly. What an interesting little detail in Exodus. It makes a little bit of sense in the story. But then you remember back in Acts chapter 12, where Peter was in prison. What did the angel say to him exactly? Did it sound something like grab your cloak and put on your... Do you see the connection between the language here? The angel tells Peter to get up quickly. He tells him to put on his cloak and get his sandals on his feet and leave quickly. Okay, then there's also Peter at the very end of this, when he's explaining what had happened. I think it's verse 17 of Acts chapter 12, where he says he described to them how the Lord had brought him out of... How is that supposed to end? Well, if you're just going by the most times that phrase is used, the land of Egypt is the next part of that, right? Brought him out of the prison. Listen, what is Passover? What is Passover? It is a feast and a celebration that was instituted because God did what? He set captives free. That's what he did. There were these people who were enslaved. They were oppressed and taken over and trapped for all intents and purposes by Egypt. And God delivers them. And he says, you need to have this meal and remember that I, like he says in Exodus 20, I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And he did it quickly. And he did it with sandals. You got to get your sandals on your feet. You got to fasten your belt. You got to get your cloak and your staff. You got to get ready to go. And then as we're reading in Acts chapter 12, we notice, does Peter qualify as a captive? You bet. Is he about to be set free? You bet. And so the people who are praying for Peter at Mary's house are celebrating and remembering a time when God set captives free. They're remembering this time with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, celebrating the Passover, and they're rejoicing in some ways that God sets people. This is what he did. And then there's a disconnect because it seems to be that they don't believe that this is what he does. They celebrate the Passover because this is what God did, and that's great. But it seems somewhere along the lines that they forgot that this is what God does. Because as they're praying for a captive to be set free, they're surprised when it happens. As they're praying for a captive to be set free, they don't believe it when it's reported to them. There is an underlying belief in the response of the people who were praying for Peter's deliverance. The underlying belief is that God used to, but now he doesn't. I don't think, I'm reading in a little bit here. I don't think anyone in that room would say those words. I don't think anyone praying for Peter would say, yeah, God used to do that, but he doesn't do it anymore. I mean, they would probably say something like, yeah, God sets captives, he set the captives free, for sure. That's who our God is. But the implication is that he doesn't do it anymore. He did it. That's a thing God used to do, but he kind of kicked his feet up. He's taken some time off. I think similarly, we would not say that God is not working. I don't think any of us would sit here and say, God's not working anymore. He's retired from his deliverance business. It was a good run. It was a couple thousand years, but he's good now, and he does some different things. But listen, do we not identify with the people in the back room? They were praying, and they were celebrating, and they were supposed to be remembering who God is. And it turned into just remembering who God was. I think we can run into that same kind of problem. I mean, you hear it, right? God, please deliver our brother Peter from captivity. Set him free. Set him free, God. Don't let him die. Peter's here. No, he's not. God, save Peter. Please, he has so much work to do in your kingdom. He's so beneficial. Who is that? Oh my goodness, they're shocked. They don't believe it because they believed that God did and doesn't. But God does what he does. This is an instance where God is doing what God does. We have these stories in the Old Testament about God doing incredible things. About God doing, and if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes we read these stories the same way that the Christians in Acts 12 did. That's something God did then, but he doesn't do that kind of thing anymore today. And there is a sense in which that's true. God didn't deliver their entire nation out of captivity the same exact way that he did with the Israelites or with the Hebrews in Exodus. But God was and still is a God who sets the captives free. He still does what he does because God has not changed. I think we do this when we are similar to the Christians in Acts 12, surprised by answered prayer. There have been a number of times where we've been praying for something and it happens and we get surprised. I don't mean we collectively, but individually. This has happened to me more than once. Or when we attribute the answer to a prayer to someone else. I know that there is a tendency of when people get well after they've been sick to sort of pay lip service to, yeah, God is good. But boy, am I grateful for that doctor, right? The doctors really came through. Oh, I can't believe it wasn't actually as bad as I thought. There was an instance. I want to make sure I'm not misunderstood entirely here, but there was an instance several years ago where my wife's uncle, Neil, was he kicked by a deer or kicked by a horse or something? And he had something going on with his hip and it wouldn't go away. And so they went to the doctor to check it out. And the report was cancer, stage 4, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And him and his wife and their 3 girls were getting ready to move to Germany for a couple months because they had some sort of trial that they could be a part of. And I mean, it was a big deal. We prayed about it, and he went back to the doctor. It was probably 3 weeks later to get checked up on, and they said, yeah, we were totally wrong. No cancer there. We must have mixed up results or something. He said something to the effect of, are you in the business of scaring people to death? And hung up the phone or something like that. That was kind of the sentiment. There was something about that made me go, we didn't even need to be praying about that. I remember having that thought. Maybe. I don't know. I never took a look inside of his hip. I don't know what was going on. Is it not possible that God cleared that up quickly? Is it also not possible that our prayers allowed him to be healed from whatever else it was? We look at things like that, whether it's quickly or very, very slowly, and we often find someone else to praise for what good has been done. The underlying implication that none of us would say we believe is that God used to but doesn't. I want to make it very clear. We've got 3 things this evening I want to say very clearly. God still is who he is. God still does what he does. And we need to look for it. We need to look for it. The first thing, is really simple. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it. We serve the same God. James says that God is the same, and there's no variation or shadow due to change in his nature. There's a problem in our world, and there's a whole other lesson, but there's a problem with thinking that the God of the Old Testament is not desirable and that Jesus of the New Testament is cool. Well, it's the same God. It's the same God. God is the same person in Genesis as he is in Revelation and as he is today. When you think about God, he hasn't changed. The character of God hasn't changed. Secondly, God is still working in the world. Now, we don't always know what that looks like. But you know what? Maybe they didn't always know what that looked like either when it was happening. How many of the prophets were well listened to? Not a whole lot. As a matter of fact, the prophets would have been fired from a lot of preaching jobs. For one, they did some crazy things. But for two, nobody listened to them, right? No one listened to the prophets. Because seeing what God is doing when it's happening is not an easy thing. It doesn't happen easily. But he is still the same God, and he is still working. I want to run through a couple of things that are pictured that God does in the Old Testament. One of the first things we see God do is create. God creates. Genesis 1, Genesis 2, God created the heavens and the earth. And when he's finished creating in Genesis 1, he partners with humans. It's a really bad business deal. Like, he partners with a human to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Says, you guys are going to do this with me. Okay, well, if he's the same God, does he still partner with humans? You bet. What are we told in the New Testament? We're told that Jesus says to go into all the world and make disciples and teach them the things that I have taught you, right? So Jesus says, I've got a mission. You guys are going to help me. He's partnering with humans. And then the implication is you also are going to spread this. In Acts chapter 1, he says, you'll be my witness in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and into the ends of the earth. You hear fill the earth and subdue it in that? There's a partnering that still takes place between God and humans. You think about seeing the hurting. One of the next first couple of things that God does in Genesis is in Genesis 4. It says that God hears, this is the story of Cain and Abel. After Cain rises up and kills Abel, the thing that God does in that story is he hears the blood of the innocent. This is a motif that's repeated by the prophets several times. It's definitely something that tracks when you just remember that God hears the blood, but God hears the cries of the blood of people. You get to the flood and you think, what did that sound like when the whole world was full of violence? You get to the story of the judges and you think, man, what did that sound like when it wasn't just God, it wasn't just the evil people committing violence, but it was also God's people engaging in this violence. God hears the blood of the innocent. He does. I think it's in Hebrews that the Hebrew writer says the blood of Abel still speaks. Still, God hears the blood of the innocent. God seeing the hurting. A couple chapters later in Genesis, Hagar is abused in a sort of way and then abused in a more direct way, and she runs pregnant and in the wilderness, and she's out there by herself, and God comes to her and provides for her, and she names God. The first person to ever call God a name, she calls him a God of seeing, Jehovah Jireh. She says, you're a God who sees me. Does God still see us today? Man, you can't get too far in the book without finding God seeing people who are hurting. And God rescues the oppressed. It happens over and over and over again. God takes care of the people who can't take care of themselves. He is still working today, just like he did back then. And so lastly, we just have to look for him. We got to look for him. Like I said, it's not easy to look right here and right now and say, God is working just like that, I'm sure of it. In fact, Mordecai in the story of Esther, he doesn't say, this is why you're here. He tells Esther, maybe, perhaps, it is for this reason that you've been put in this position. And if you don't take care of business, someone else will be raised up and deliver the Jews, right? But in order to say perhaps, you have to be looking for God. You've got to be looking for how he works in your life. Often we can't see it when it's happening, but we can look back and say, there's no other way that made sense if it wasn't for God working. We've got to be looking for him. Paul similarly uses this idea of perhaps God is working. We see several different examples of people looking for God. Paul talks in Acts chapter 17 that he says that people are searching for God even though he's not very far from us. In Romans chapter 1, we're told that God's invisible attributes are clearly seen since the creation of the world. God is everywhere. There's a line in a movie called August Rush, which is a cute little movie. It's got some good music. It's really just a movie about music. And the boy says, there's music all around us. You just have to listen. I think that's a beautiful sentiment about our God. God is, as Paul says, in all, above all, and in all, and through all. God is everywhere. He's all over the place. You just have to look for him because we serve the same God who is still working. Same God, still working. We need to fight our temptation, fight our tendency, maybe I should say, to think about God as being retired from his work. We need to fight our tendency to think about God as having taken time off after a long time of dealing with his people. That God is no longer engaging in human or mindful or caring about human everyday life. We're not given that picture in Scripture at all. Not one time. And yet it underlies a lot of the way that we live. God is still here. He's the same God. He's still working. And it's up to us to keep an eye out and look for him. This is a silly example, but I think the silly examples sometimes make for the best illustrations. There's a guy I was listening to, and he's talking about how Jewish teachers teach. And he said, Jewish teachers don't believe in raising your hand to ask a question, which we generally do, right? Like if someone's teaching and someone needs to make a comment in class, you raise your hand, right? And the Jewish rabbis don't believe in raising your hand. They say if a question comes into your mind, who's to say it wasn't done by God? So ask it. Because what I have prepared is for me, but what you have come to you could be from God. Not for sure. I'm not saying that's the way it works, but possibly. Some of the best Bible studies we've had on Tuesday nights have come as a result of really, really off-topic questions. Maybe God is moving in ways that we can look back on and see later. This doesn't mean that everything that we think is wrong, and this is again not one of those lessons where you need to throw everything out and extrapolate all the logical conclusions. But it's a lesson that I think invites us to see God working in our life, to be active and not surprised when God is doing something in the world, and to trust that the picture we're given, the God that we follow, is still the same God, and he's still working in us. This is a lesson that, in a lot of ways, doesn't point to the cross, but the cross is an ultimate example of what we're talking about. God's work of salvation was begun at the cross and is still happening in our world today, and that invitation is always open to obey the gospel and to see God working in your life. And if you need prayers of the church, or if you need to be baptized and become a Christian and follow Christ, whatever you need, this is the time where we offer that invitation. You can come and let us know while we stand and sing.